Right. Hello and welcome everyone to this Reuters Events and Tradeshift webinar on preparing for peak season. I'm joined by a fantastic panel today to discuss the upcoming peak season period in a very unusual time, as we are all aware. I'm joined by Charles Brewer, who is the COO of Canada Post, Jamie Lansdell, the manager for Expeditors for Automotive and Mobility, and Alan Edwards, client executive for UK and Northern Europe at Tradeshift. So just quickly, I'll hand over to everyone individually to give a bit more depth about themselves and their role at their company. So Charles, would you like to start off?
I would, so thank you very much. And my apologies to anybody who's listening to this and may hear a bit of building work. I have a building site around me today, and I think we've got a few other things going on around. So I guess it's the environment we operate in today. Anyway, very briefly, my name's Charles, and as mentioned, I'm the CEO for Canada Post. I've been here since February, and prior to Canada Post, I was with DHL for 35 years around various parts of the world. So very delighted to be here.
Fab. And Alan?
Hi, yeah, thank you. Hi, everybody. Alan Edwards. I'm a client executive at Tradeshift. I have been for 3 years working in the Northern Europe region and primarily with our transport and logistics companies. For those of you who don't know about Tradeshift, we were founded in Copenhagen in 2010, and we're focused on a technology to help companies grow in the digital space for global trade. And we have a global network of 1.5 million companies, which is the largest of its type.
Fab. And finally, Jamie.
Hey, brilliant. Welcome along. So I'm Jamie Lansdell. I'm the Automotive and Mobility vertical leader here at Expeditors. And Expeditors, we hire people with industry insight to help drive certain aspects of our business. So I come from 24 years, showing my age, 24 years of high-tech technology, design, manufacture, and into transportation and logistics. So looking forward to this conversation today.
Thanks everyone, and just a reminder to our audience, before we kick off the questions and the discussion, to send in your questions if you have any, because we'll get sort of 15 minutes at the end where we can delve into some of the topics that are sort of most interest to you with our panelists. So sort of to start off, we'll go quite broad. Obviously, we all know it's been a sort of unusual 6 months to say the least, and certainly so for the transportation and logistics industry. So I'd like to sort of start off to get everyone's take on what they've seen in the last 6 months and kind of lessons that they have picked up. So yeah, Charles, what are your thoughts on that topic?
Well, the first thing I would say, I'm very jealous of Jamie's studio setup, which is a result of COVID-19. I hope we didn't have that pre-COVID-19, but so I guess that's one of the things that changed our life. I mean, but anyway, yeah, I mean, in all seriousness, yeah, COVID-19 has been challenging to say the least. And, you know, I work in the postal and parcel sector, and for us, it's just been a tipping point in terms of how we operate. So if I sort of just tell the story very briefly. So back in February when I joined, I had a month out and about sort of seeing the plants. We have about 60,000 people here in Canada, about 20 odd plants, major plants and facilities. So I was out and about seeing those. Everything was tickety-boo. I went to Vancouver, watched the Rugby Sevens, had a few beers, sat in a stadium with 50,000 people, everything's happy. Walked back in on Monday morning and COVID-19 started. And, you know, again, if we had, I just don't think anybody could have guessed we'd end up where we ended up. But for us, I mean, from Canada Post perspective, you know, there were sort of 2 or 3 things in terms of guiding principles. One was making sure we keep our people safe. That's been completely consistent throughout COVID-19, and will continue to do so as we look forward. The second one was keeping our customers safe, both the shippers and sellers, but also we serve Canadians, so the consumer. And thirdly was continuing to deliver the smile in the last mile, making sure that we could keep Canada connected as an essential service. So that was the guiding principles. I have to say we went sort of through various phases of our journey through COVID-19. The first one was, you know, complete chaos. So everything that was being thrown at us every day was brand new, and you have to work out a brand new operation every single day, you know, from physical distancing to masks, should you wear them, shouldn't you wear them, gloves, hand sanitization. I mean, the rules of the game are still changing every single day today, but certainly in the first few weeks, it was chaos. And then you get sort of a position of, I kind of get it, and you start to work in that new environment, that new operating environment. And now we're sort of very focused in the third stage. We're very focused in terms of how do we position Canada Post for success going forward. And, you know, to anybody sort of not perhaps so familiar with why that would be a relevant question, about 4 or 5 Mondays ago, we delivered the same amount of parcels, more than 2 million parcels, a number that we had forecasted we would do in 2029. So we're sort of 9 years ahead in terms of the volumes that we're handling, with pretty much the same infrastructure. So I was asked the other day, you know, so what does that mean in terms of automation and your plans? Everything we had planned to do from an automation perspective, you know, back at sort of out in 5 or 6 or 7 years is now estimated in 5 or 6 or 7 weeks, you know, just trying to accelerate our ability to handle the volume and the demand that's coming. So it's been a really, you know, challenging time. But I think just last couple of comments. One is, you know, it would be remiss of me not to say thank you to my team who've done an outstanding job, like many postal operators, but they've done an outstanding job through this, and for the most part done it with a smile on their face, you know, just handling huge volumes and also some rather bizarre volumes like kayaks and barbecue sets. I think Jamie ordered a brand new barbecue set that I may or may not have delivered, but you know, so just really some really weird and wonderful stuff that our team have been handling. And the second thing is that there is you know, I tend to be an optimist. I think there's a flip side to COVID-19 from a positive perspective. It's helped us to realize that we need to invest at an accelerated rate in our infrastructure, and whether that be physical or digital or anything else. So we now have our foot firmly placed on the accelerator in terms of how we do that. So really challenging 6 months or so. I think we've got a few more twists and turns to go, but on the flip side, we're working really, really fast to make it even better Canada Post on the other side and make sure we're set up for success going forward.
Perfect. Alan, what have you seen sort of within your role in terms of sort of the clients that you work with as well? Have you seen a similar acceleration that Charles was mentioning?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just to build on what Charles said, I don't think we've ever had an event on this global scale before. You know, we've had events before that were, you know, horrible, like the tsunami in Japan, or, you know, the volcano with Iceland, where we were, you know, things were happening that stopped the supply chain. But I don't think we've ever had a global event that in itself, you know, fundamentally changed the way operations had to work. But more importantly, actually in itself drove a demand of increase, you know, of online shopping, of digital buying, and that in itself put a strain on the transport and logistics industry. And some of the things that we've seen from a Tradeshift perspective, obviously trying to, you know, firms really struggling with their BCP, where, you know, even their backup sites are being impacted. You know, their operations are having to change on a daily basis. BPO shared services perhaps are impacted. You know, just something as simple as getting an invoice through the door from a seller to a buyer, you know, and keeping that supply chain flowing has never been sort of hit at this rate. And I think we have an index of global trade health, which we take from our network at Tradeshift, which just kind of gives us an indication of how, you know, the global orders and activity is going. And, you know, we saw a 15% dip in Q1 to Q2. So it's starting to pick up in June, where was the first time we sort of saw orders start to overtake invoices again. But I mean, yeah, fundamentally, everyone's been hit in the same way. And I think the supply chains with the most kind of agility, which is a kind of classic phrase, how agile is your supply chain? But those with their closest relationships to their sellers and strongest relationships to their sellers have had the most success of being able to flip that around quickly, you know, and react to those key kind of demands that the supply chain was being put under. So it's definitely been a challenging time for our customers, and it's nice that Tradeshift is part of that solution space, but obviously not underestimating just what they're going through from an operational perspective as well.
Absolutely. And sort of you mentioned there about sort of, you know, the importance of relationships between suppliers as sort of being really key. So that's definitely something that we'll get into sort of a little bit later in this webinar. Jamie, I don't know if that's something, you know, sort of Alan mentioned about sort of the dip in sort of, you know, movements in Q1 and Q2 and sort of the sort of slight increase in Q3 that's happening now. Is that something that you're seeing?
It is in the same way. So I look after a key segment of our business, of the automotive industry. And that could be anyone from, you know, there are certain areas of the industry that have had massive disruption. There are certain areas of industry that have had a massive uptick, as Charles alluded to, that that COVID has been an enabler to move things faster and to bring through technology or to break through some bottlenecks into actually capitalizing on some opportunities. But we as an organization, we have 18,000 employees worldwide. And as we first saw the breakout within Wuhan, and we saw effectively a shockwave of disruption across the globe, we saw a shockwave of disruption. And so supply chains, all of us have, I'm sure whatever sector you're in, that global shockwave and that first disruption area within Wuhan, and then Greater China, and then we saw parts of the US and Europe go onto lockdown. And we've seen this gently migrate into different areas. So this has been probably the most volatile period in recent history. We, as an organization, try to take a 30,000-foot view, as Alan said. Yes, there have been events like this before. That volatility is the new normal. We've seen what happened with the tsunami in Japan, or the volcano. I was going to try to say the name, Alan, but I won't. The volcano in Iceland that changed sort of supply chain disruption. But really, COVID has been a massive change for us all. And then just moving that slightly to the right is as we've seen areas reopen, we've seen then a second wave hit certain areas. We've seen some people come through it unscathed and be out the other side. So the next 6 months is a hugely telling period for us all, and I'm sure today we're going to share quite a lot of experience between us as to how that's affected some different supply chains and how we can all learn lessons moving forward.
Absolutely. I mean, all of that sort of lays the foundation perfectly, really, for the topic of this webinar, and that's what we're looking at over the next few months in peak season. So yeah, taking all of that into consideration. I mean, do you feel have you changed your approach to peak season based on sort of the COVID-19 pandemic, the recent 6 months? And what are you expecting over the next sort of few months to see? So yeah, we'll start off with Charles again, if that's all right.
Yeah, so the way sort of phrase has been coined is peak on peak. So we're already operating at peak levels in terms of volumes. So again, pretty consistent. Most postal operators are running between sort of 20 and 40% up year on year in terms of volume. At the peak of COVID-19, when most were on lockdown, it was more like 100% up year on year. And then you've got peak coming weeks 48 to 52. And as I say, I think you were going to find it's going to be peak on peak. So I guess like most of my colleagues around the world who work in this space, they're all sort of working with the same sort of opportunity and headache. And I guess a couple of points. One is, there's no question that demand is greater than supply. So it doesn't matter whether it's domestic or international, and with the exception of a few markets, but demand is going to outstrip supply. So, and you've seen plenty of evidence just over the last few weeks of logistics operators, from the big 3PLs through to whoever else, implementing surcharges to try and do two things. One is sort of, in some respects, control that demand, both in terms of the volume, but I think more importantly in terms of the shape. So, again, like I mentioned earlier on, historically, if you wanted to buy a barbecue set, you probably popped down your local home furnishing store and bought it, but because that's not necessarily an option, you buy that online, or you've become an online shopper through COVID-19. So we're seeing people buying weirder and stranger things. I think that's very true across the world. So number one, the sort of large 3PLs and postal operators are having to deal with this sort of increased demand, but also this increased shape and size, which I think is incredibly challenging for the infrastructure they've built. We haven't built an infrastructure for barbecues and kayak. We have an infrastructure built for 9 kilo, 10 kilo type packets and boxes. So that's one. And so you're seeing sort of an increased usage in surcharges, and we can talk later about how perhaps to mitigate some of those challenges for sellers and vendors later on in the call. But so we're certainly seeing that. Secondly, what most, I think many don't perhaps appreciate is that, as I mentioned earlier on, the health and safety of our employees is paramount, and of our customers. So we've instigated, like, again, most postal operators and most logistics companies, all the right measures to try and protect our employees. So social distancing, masks, hand sanitizers, and then you have the increased absenteeism because of high-risk employees that shouldn't be in the workplace. So that creates an attendance level that's lower than normal. So you have more volume, bigger, stranger shaped items in the same infrastructure, but with perhaps less people and less productivity. That creates that supply demand challenge from a domestic perspective. Internationally, it's created by just less planes and ships moving, which means you've got less capacity around the world. So I think the short version is it is going to be a tough peak season. I think that's well known already by most that play in the space and work in this space, but there are things you can do about it, and we'll get to that later on. So definitely peak within peak. There's a lot of challenges ahead. We're working hard and furious, and again, like everybody else, hard and fast and furious to plan and prepare for it as best we possibly can, but it's not going to be an easy one.
Absolutely. Jamie, I mean, sort of, have you seen, a similar sort of uptake in terms of health and safety? Are there, certain trends that you're leaning towards sort of Expeditors over the next few months?
Yeah, in the same way, it's been a hugely challenging environment, and for us, we implemented a work from home scenario where, I think I've been at home now probably like the rest of the team for nigh on 8 months now, and in the same way, 18,000 employees, and then a huge amount of customers. We've got to take very, very sensitive and careful measures to make sure that we can protect ourselves, protect our customers, and protect supply chains. And it's what we've tended to see is a lot of our customers, used to be just in time, but what we're seeing now is just in case. So in that way that we know we're heading in towards a more volatile period, we know with the rollout of the vaccine is going to take up more capacity that isn't even there with the lack of air freight and some of the ocean freight blank sailings that we're seeing. So we're going to see this peak on peak. I like that, Charles, and I think that's a great phrase. So we're going to see huge challenges moving forward, and this is really a lot of what I hope we can talk about today, into how we can learn some lessons into how we can cope with this peak on peak scenario. So yeah, interesting times ahead for all of us, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, sort of, a big takeaway, I think, for our audience will be around sort of contingency planning and how to, how to ultimately prepare for this upcoming season, which will be, changing week on week. So, I mean, Alan, what are your thoughts on that particular topic area? Are you sort of recommending, any particular moves with your clients? What are your thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, and again, from where Tradeshift can, technology and services can help, it's about where we can, sort of offer tactical, operational, or strategic advantage, I guess, during those times. And just picking up on what both Charles and Jamie said, it's interesting to see that a lot of the peak time preparations that we normally get sort of pulled into with our customers, about infrastructure, is it got the capacity, the bandwidth, all of those questions, those were happening in sort of July, August time this year, rather than, in preparation around September, October. So you can already see the strain on the supply chain and obviously the infrastructure that's already in place. And I think the world is tired of this phrase new normal, because everybody, to their credit, was very quick to react to the COVID situation and try and make the best of a bad situation and obviously keep everything flowing. But I think we've had a bit of a false dawn in some respects, because we're still in contingency mode. Governments are still ploughing money into the supply chains. People are still potentially going to be in a lockdown scenario again. So this idea of new normal, we're not quite sure what that new normal is yet. And I think the best thing that people can do at this point, and certainly where Tradeshift is focused, is very much around the strength, the efficiency, and the liquidity of the supply chain specifically. So if you've got strong enough collaborative relationships in your supply chain, is your data sharing strong enough so you can preempt trending? Is it adaptable enough so that you can react to the BCP scenarios that are bound to come up again over the next couple of months at a really critical time? And then when you start to look at your efficiency, can you make that throughput time reduction? Can you make it more touchless? Can you start using AI and things like that to do coding for you and start unlocking some of that that ability to be more streamlined? And then I guess in terms of the liquidity topic, 1 in 4 businesses are impacted by financial failure. I mean, that's of a seller at some point. And this is the most desperate times for sellers, particularly who, are trying to sort of get money, keep the supply chain going, provide services. And we've seen a lot of defensive type tactics, which is fair enough during this period, where you see, extended payment terms, but things like that actually kind of compound the issue, because you're actually pulling money away from potentially the sellers that need it. So actually what we want to be starting to see is getting that liquidity into the supply chain as best you can. And Tradeshift's had a pilot recently in Denmark, which is where our company was founded, with the Danish Export Credit Agency, where we were looking at piloting a program designed to unlock around 55 billion in supplier payments in 12 months. So there's things like that are taking place to try and drive liquidity where it's needed, rather than, sort of where we don't quite know where governments are going with this injection of money in a blanket effect into the supply chain. So there's a few sort of things that we can do, but I think preparation is the key. If you can analyze that data, you can see where things have gone wrong and had the time to take stock over the last 6 months. I think it got as bad as it probably could. It may get worse, but it's certainly not going to be much different from what we've seen at peak time of the COVID virus. And it's about how you set yourself up to go forward from there.
I just want to add to, I think that's a really, really good point, by the way. So, the COVID situation obviously is, some people have benefited, some people haven't, but there's a lot of small and medium-sized companies out there that really struggled through COVID-19, whether it's in whatever industry they're in. And I think logistics operators around the world are working hard to try and get help and get those companies back on the ground. If you're a very large platform, the big platform operators that are selling into this space, I'm talking about e-commerce specifically, then you've made hay while the sun has shined, and very successfully, I hasten to add. But that doesn't necessarily help the small and medium-sized retailers. And I think that brick and mortar was already in a bit of a tipping point, a bit of a problem already. But COVID-19 has clearly accelerated that. I think that, again, being slightly the optimist, well, not slightly, very much the optimist, but being slightly biased towards the small and medium. One of the things we've certainly seen is that they've responded, and it always struck me as rather bizarre that there were so many companies that weren't online pre-COVID, I faced with. And again, if you take the flip side of COVID-19, for those who have decided to push back and fight back and stand on their own 2 feet and try and make a success of it, we've seen a big push and a big change where retailers, small and medium-sized retailers and brands, are pushing to get online as quickly as they possibly can and capture that opportunity. Because again, if you look at the sort of context of that, around about, I'm sure everybody on this, I can definitely tell most people on this webinar shop online and probably shop online a lot. But anyway, to the point, still only about pre-COVID, about 12 or 13% of what was bought is bought online. So it's still a fairly small number. It was growing very healthily, but it was only 10 or 12%. Obviously, COVID-19 has accelerated that. And the big question is how much of that sticks. How many people who've switched and become online shoppers stay online shoppers going forward? There'll be a bit of a change as countries start to open up again. But there will be a big proportion of those that will stick. And to the point, which I fundamentally agree with, it's about how do we help those small and medium-sized companies to get back on their feet and to start operating again, because it can't just be a 2-platform business around the world. Yeah.
Alan, have you seen the same thing? We talked about a shockwave earlier, about how disruption affected flows of material around the world. But in the same thing with large enterprise into small and medium enterprise, and whether it's the automotive and mobility industry, or whether it's e-commerce, or this is probably the same across the board. But when lockdown happened, effectively, those who had made hay whilst the sun shone and had the assets or the cash to deal with that lockdown, it's the small and medium enterprises that have felt that financial shockwave. So, if the big 2 closed down for a couple of months or so, then the next wave won't have been paid until 30 days after that. Then the tier 2s won't have been paid for perhaps 30 days after that. And that's the area of most industry that will have been at risk throughout this. So certainly in the automotive and mobility segment, we've seen consolidation. We've seen lots of the bigger fish swallow smaller fish, or people who are in constraints with this. But in the same way is as we're coming out of this, we're really seeing a smaller world, less those who have really prepared for the harsh reality of what we've just seen are going to dominate, and they're the ones who've been able to put money or more money into e-retail and e-commerce platforms, or finding a route to their sellers away from the traditional platforms, I guess. So have you both seen that kind of setup in your industries?
Go for it. Alan, you want to go? Yeah, Alan, you can go first, and I'll have you.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, there's an element of it that you know, fundamentally, there's some parts of the T&L business and the providers to that. You know, it's difficult to be a successful tire provider when you can't get hold of tires, and you know, and things like that that just fundamentally keep the industry going. But I think, you know, across the board of all our verticals, we've definitely seen, you know, the impact of COVID is the same in terms of, you know, its impact, the greatness of its impact, and the way that businesses have had to react around their digital strategy, but also just their day-to-day working. And those companies with lots of assets, you know, when you think about something like an airline where it has, you know, planes and pilots and all sorts of costs that just continue to run, irrelevant of whether they're flying or not, is obviously going to be less agile than perhaps an organization that has, you know, no assets at all. So it's something like an e-commerce platform. But I don't think that dictates from you know, the changes that had to be made from an operational perspective, and the challenges in terms of overcoming those are very similar. So the same key lessons can be learned. Where can you be more efficient? You know, where can you see where a process is actually detrimental rather than, you know, adding value to you, and I think that those lessons are the same. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen that impact across the board.
Yeah, and likewise, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen sort of this sort of rise of the small and medium online seller, which is really starting to grow at a rapid rate. And certainly, you know, the conversation is in terms of their preparation for peak. They're looking for how, obviously, logistics operators like us can help them be successful. So I think the world's, you know, again, if we were running at sort of 12-13% of what's being bought online, it's probably more like an 18 or a 20 now. So it's moved us forward by 4. It depends on who you read. Some people would tell you 2 years. Some people would tell you 10 years. I reckon it's about 4 or 5 years. The world, according to Charles, is probably about 4 or 5 years that we've moved the e-commerce environment on. And again, going back to the original question and sort of where we started this particular part of the webinar is for logistics operators how to keep up and how to get the capacity at the level that is 4 or 5 years advanced. And that draws on us also. Well, you've got physical space that you're trying to create as quickly as you possibly can. But I think increasingly so, and again, talking to my colleagues and peers around the world, it's about being smart, you know, using automation and technology as best we possibly can to create incremental capacity. It's about being smart with the infrastructure you already have. So how can you gain and sweat the asset even further and still get another 10 or 20% out of your existing assets? Otherwise, it costs a lot of money to build that capacity. But yeah, there's no question about it. When I'm not on webinars, I spend most of my day with my team focusing on how do we rapidly create the right environment that supports small and medium-sized sellers, but of course the big ones too. I mean, they're on the phone to us every single day wanting more and more capacity, more and more space. So it's a bit of both, but yeah, it's good fun, as they say.
Perfect. I have a question actually around sort of customer expectations, and sort of I've sort of read reports that it has been altered in COVID because everyone understands obviously longer lead times and kind of the strain on the industry. Do you think that customer expectations will be how they typically are in peak season this year, or do you think that they will, you know, sort of be more understanding, and how are you preparing for that?
Maybe I'll just jump in. So it's been interesting, you know. Let me give both sides of the coin. So on the one hand, there's been an outpouring of appreciation and love from the majority of, and I'm talking about Canada, the majority of Canadians just thanking the postal operators and the delivery agents for doing what they do day in, day out. They've been, just don't forget as well, and I don't want any violins playing, but you know, these guys and girls have been doing this 24/7 now for 6 months. So I think it was Alan who mentioned it earlier. It's not like we just woke up on a Monday and start delivering kayaks and barbecues and then we finish on a Friday. Because of the volume, we're working 7 days, well, for the most part, working 7 days a week, and they've been doing that for 4, 5, 6 months. And again, as I mentioned, and to your question, for the most part, the appreciation from the Canadian consumer has been amazing. I mean, we've had drawings on sidewalks and pictures in windows, and stones painted, and our delivery post boxes with little messages. I mean, it's been really wonderful. It's really heartwarming, and we've had drive-by cavalcades with people tooting their horns saying thank you to essential workers, nurses, postal operators, etc. So it is something that I will definitely take away. That said, there's also an element who want their barbecue set at 5 o'clock on a Friday evening and not at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. And I suppose rightly so. They have a right to say, hey, hurry up, and maybe don't fully appreciate some of the challenges we had. I think, the reality is, and going back to what I said earlier, we have peak on peak, and so we already know that the service is not going to be where the service level is normally, and I think it's true for all postal and logistics operators. It's all, peak is normally a challenge from a service perspective, and most companies, from the biggest to the smallest, drop their service standards through that period. I think it's going to be tougher still as we go into peak. I think for the most part there is an understanding, so I don't anticipate too many emails to myself. I'm not going to give you my email address just in case, but I don't expect it to change fundamentally. But I think one of the things that we've observed through COVID-19, and again going back to the point, what does it mean, and how does that change our operation? Visibility and predictability have become much more important than, in fact, maybe than time. So if you've ordered something, unless it's actually mission critical, most people are okay with 2 or 3 days or whatever it may be, but not necessarily having really good visibility and really good predictability tends to create greater customer dissatisfaction than the time itself. So again, something we're working hard on is how do we create great reliability within the movement of the goods. I think that's definitely something that came through. Again, as I mentioned earlier, taking the things that we think we need to work on through COVID-19 is that ability to have I don't like using the phrase, but the Uber-like visibility for a packet and parcel, so people know where their barbecue set is and when it's likely to be delivered. That's become more critical than perhaps even time itself. So for the most part, people have been really great, yeah.
That definitely speaks to sort of the accelerated digitization, which you've all sort of alluded to actually on sort of a few occasions throughout. I know sort of Jamie, I've spoken to you previously about this. This is a really key thing that you're working on at Expeditors, and I kind of want to just find out what that looks like in terms of what elements do you need in order to create this sort of complete digital strategy that we need right now.
Absolutely, and to follow on from Charles's point is our customers and our customers' needs are the most important aspect of any logistics or T&R operation, and over communication is no relationship. The key to a good relationship is getting through the difficult times together, of having that clear communication, of setting objectives, and we see ourselves as shepherds to help our customers through the difficult times, and this digitization of how we want to help our customers move forward is a key aspect of how we can really help our customers learn moving forward. So volatile events is the key that we see behind the scenes is visibility. If you can really find out where the bottlenecks in your supply chain are, you can really do a number of things. Number one is you can really streamline your inventory, which is cash that is held at any customer. Number two is when you establish bottlenecks within a supply chain, you can actually free up capacity because you may well find out that you don't need to have as many parts on the water. You may not need as many parts in the process if, let's say, they're stuck at a customs brokerage point, or let's say they're stuck in at another point before they're offloaded into the warehouse. So digitization is the key aspect to really help understand the idiosyncrasies of where products are within a supply chain. And this is really the key that we are working with strategic partnerships with our customers, because our customers currently have their head down and are focusing on the tactical of day-to-day issues that are causing us all sleepless nights. I mean, we're all working very, very hard, but we're trying to really help our customers take tactical steps in a strategic direction to say, hey, if you do this today, this small, tiny, minute step, this is going to help you in this long vision into actually making sure that the next time this happens, or when we hit peak season, this is what we can do to streamline your supply chain. So digitization, I'm sure, Alan, this is something that fits in very well with you as well, we see this as the future for our customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you made an important point there. I think that apart from the digitalization, which I'll come to in a second, but you know, and Charles mentioned it too. I mean, we're all operating in extreme stress or extended stress than we would normally do, even in day to day. So you were talking about how customers are quite forgiving of delivery, but some of them are furious about their barbecues, and that's a symptom of the operating environment that we're all in. You know, we're all not quite sure what's coming next, and this digital strategy, this idea of accelerating, your digitization has always been kind of a Tradeshift mantra. And it's only now that those cogs are beginning and those pieces are beginning to fall into place in terms of why that's important. It's only worth accelerating something if it gets you to a positive destination quicker. Just trying to accelerate your digital strategy when it's been probably in the past done by certain departments within organizations, or siloed because finance wants to be more efficient, or procurement wants a better buying tool or whatever. Whereas actually now, when you look at this in the context of this global pandemic, actually the whole legitimacy or operating capability of your business is tied to this, because what it does is it lets you see, as Jamie quite rightly said, the data quickly and effectively to be able to then make changes to your organization that keeps you tactically advanced, or gives you an operational advantage to stay afloat or to stay trading at a time when you're absolutely at capacity. So you can't really underestimate that. And I think the other thing that's quite important during this time is we've never really had everybody trying to do the same things in a vertical before. So this has, again, as it impacted the globe, it's impacted everybody in different but very similar ways. So thought leadership, such as events like this, but certainly in terms of, within your own businesses, or with, as working groups or strategic customer councils, which is something that Tradeshift is very firmly a believer in, is sharing those ideas where you can start to create a collaboration where you have things the same, where you can make efficiency more prominent, and where you can start to get a strategic advantage again. And if you're all trying to do that together, actually, obviously there's still a competitive element to the trade, but actually you're making things easier inside your own organization and doing things in a stronger way. So I think thought leadership particularly there is a big one. And then just lastly, when we were talking about the supply chain again, 47% of supplier collaboration, according to Forbes, failed due to a lack of trust or a lack of engagement. And what we tend to see with digital transformation is a company decides to use a system, and then they try and drag all of the users of that system, or would-be users, along with them. And there isn't really a benefit for the user. Whereas actually, if you're looking at something that's true digitization, you're actually giving a benefit to the users as well. So your seller base, for example, if you're talking about Tradeshift, you get the seller gets more data as well as the buyer getting more data. And actually what you're trying to do then is create even more resilience within your supply chain, because you're giving value back into it as well as creating a digital advantage for yourself. So it's bringing all of those elements together, whether that's internally or thought leadership from the outside, or whatever that may be, and looking at that as a whole for your business operating model, not just as a way for your finance team to be more efficient, or another silo to be better. You need to look at it as a whole and bring those ideas together to be effective.
Perfect. Just sort of a quick reminder to sort of the audience, we're coming up to the Q&A portion very shortly, so please do send in your questions. If this is very sort of interesting discussion, so please do send in your questions. We've got a few around technology, which we've just discussed, but sort of a final, big question really that I wanted to pose to you all, and it's very much sort of related to what we've just been discussing around sort of the acceleration of digitalization. How do you see the industry changing in the next 5 years or so in light of all of these developments that you're seeing sort of internally and with companies that you work with? Charles, would you like to take it?
I was on mute, sorry. Yeah, no, I'm happy to do. I only put a caveat in brackets. It's hard for me to predict what I'll do this afternoon, let alone what I'll do in the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And I think COVID-19 is probably, once again, it's sort of is a good illustration that you can't be too fixed on how things may end up. We have to remain relatively agile. Anyway, but I'll try and get to the point. I think three things from an industry perspective. Again, because postal operators are primarily in the mail and e-commerce parcel world. I think COVID-19 will accelerate the mail decline. So transactional mail was already declining for all mail operators globally. I think COVID-19 will accelerate that. So more companies during COVID were digitalizing the paper that we receive through the post. So I think we'll see that accelerate. I think, as I already mentioned, e-commerce. There was a great study that was done, or a good study that was done fairly recently, that sort of looked at what's the tipping point for acceleration of any new product. And it said that when you get to about 20% penetration for any product, so Apple, iPhone, Samsung, S5, whatever it may be, when you get about 20% penetration, the thing accelerates at a rapid rate. And I believe that we're probably pretty close to that 20% from an e-commerce perspective. So it's back to my point I made earlier. How many of the new online buyers will stay online post-COVID, if there is such a thing? I think will be much greater than perhaps people think. I think people that previously weren't comfortable in buying cucumbers online will suddenly now become very comfortable buying cucumbers online. So I think we're going to see that sort of e-commerce penetration number that I talked about accelerate further still, in the growth numbers. 25, it was CAGR at about 25% cross-border and 10% domestic pre-COVID. I think we'll see those double-digit numbers stay fairly strong. So I think we'll see e-commerce accelerate at a rapid rate. So that brings us back to what does it mean for 3PLs and postal and parcel operators like ourselves. And again, it sounds a bit boring and it's a bit repetitive, but it is all about building the right capacity for the right customers and the right products that you want to ship. So I think we're going to see a more focused approach from logistics operators on who do they really want to operate for, who do they want to provide capacity for. And again, without sort of naming names, there's been quite a few examples of that over the last 3 months, of companies making fairly difficult and taking very difficult decisions on, we don't want to be the capacity for everything, because it's just not sustainable. The margins you make in e-commerce are not sustainable. So I think we'll see a more focused approach from logistics operators on who do they really want to buddy up with and create the right capacity for the right product, etc. That's one piece. I think the second piece, and I've talked about it a lot already, a very, very accelerated pace of implementation for things that were on the nice to have list and now on the must have list. So automation can mean many things, from AGVs through we talked about some of it already, through drones and whatever else. A lot of those were on the nice to have list a few months ago. They're now on the must have list. The contactless delivery, the health and safety environment we have to protect for our employees means you have to have greater distancing. You just can't do that with the number of parcels and the types of parcels we have. So I think there's going to be a greater and accelerated implementation of anything and everything that's scalable for the logistics industry. So I'm sure many of your listeners that are on this call today, and many of who will see this subsequently, will be emailing me saying, we've got another product we'd like you to look at. But the reality is, that's fantastic. It's created, and again, to Alan's comments earlier, all these startups and medium-sized tech companies that have been for probably the last few years trying to peddle their wares to companies that were saying, well, it's a nice to have, not a must have. I think you'll find a more willing and receptive audience than perhaps you have done. So I think we're going to see a rapid shift, a rapid change in technology adoption that allows the logistics industry to keep their people safe, keep their customers safe, and produce a better bottom line result in the face of this sort of surge of demand. So those are probably the three big things I think will change for us, are changing already, and will change even faster going forward.
Alan, what are your thoughts on this? Where do you see sort of the next 5 years?
Yeah, and I'm an optimist as well, like Charles. So I think that we'll see the hopefully see COVID sort of hopefully coming to a nice plateau and then disappearing. But I think the key lessons are the same, and I think the power that we demand at home, that we have in the palm of our hand. You can see where your pizza is every step of the journey, and all of those kind of things that we're used to in the home in terms of ordering goods or receiving information. That's the demand that we need to have in the business environment, and that's kind of the focus of where Tradeshift has always been, is to unlock that capability within the P2P supply chain. And I think from COVID or stay, but you need to be more efficient. You need to have more information digital so that you can then react to situations and streamline your business model to cope with peaks and troughs, as Charles was saying. And specifically, I think we'll see much more AI capability coming. That's certainly something that we're focusing very much on. Where can you start manual coding or even removing the needing for invoice coding or purchase order coding, etc. We're certainly looking at long tail spend again. If you look at the amount of time that AP departments, for example, take to process just one invoice from one seller that they'll probably potentially never do business with again, there's a number of different solutions that Tradeshift again offers, but certainly in the marketplace in more general that should be looked into, because do you really need to spend hours and hours and thousands of pounds processing a single invoice? And that's a key lesson. So this whole drive towards digital, I think, suddenly has a context that people can relate to. And I think obviously that then makes organizations more joined up in going out and procuring the right systems that will make them future-proof and agile when they need to be, and certainly day-to-day more strategically have a strategic advantage, and certainly more operationally efficient. So I think those key lessons are the same, and certainly will drive the way the market goes. And again, I just come back to the fact that at home we have immense power in the palm of our hand in terms of our phones and what we can do with them and the information we get, and that needs to be it has to come into the business world. We can't make buying so difficult sometimes for the greater business environment. It certainly needs to reflect that same power and that same amount of data that we can see day to day.
Perfect. And finally, Jamie, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm going to follow on to some of those thoughts. This has been the biggest catalyst, the biggest change to a lot of our industries. And we've talked a little bit about digitization. We've talked a little bit about breaking down the walls between silos of organizations. And data is the lifeblood of making real-time decisions of how businesses can move forward. And it's really important for now these walls have been broken down, how organizations can really look forward to preparing themselves better for events that are coming up. We're in election year, Brexit is still looming. There are still more volatile events with winter is about to set in, and there could be a second wave. So there will still be events that can happen. Now, the breakdown of these walls are going to actually help every organization be more efficient. The CFO can lean in and say, well, inventory that is held is more important to us. What can we do to streamline? What can we do to learn lessons of why are we sourcing these components from all of these international locations? Why aren't we sourcing them locally? How can we find local sourcing? To Charles's point, how can we reduce paper waste within our organization and infrastructure? How can we use digital freight booking? How can we use methodology that is up to date? A lot of industry is relatively draconian for a long time, and it hasn't had the pressure to instigate change. Whereas I think this is the tipping point. This is the point within a lot of organizations to do some what if analysis. What if we have another event that is more significant than this? What are we going to do if Brexit leads to X volatility here, or we have or we're seeing other countries like India, Brazil, Mexico are continuing up the curve with COVID. They're not out of the woods yet. What happens? So this really is the time that we can really instigate proper network design and reviewing supply chain design to say, well, why have we got this when we can have this? And really, I think that is the next 5 years. Is those types of studies are going to be incredibly important for us all to break down the walls in our organizations and put in lasting change and better systems to move forward.
Perfect. We've actually had a lot of questions come in around supply chain modelling, so that's pretty much answered that. We've had a really interesting question come in. We'll move on to the questions portion. Do air and ocean carriers have all the power, i.e. skyrocketing freight rates, or are there things we can do to push back? So maybe a contentious question.
Jamie we should all point the finger at Jamie. Just one introduction for Jamie. There's a great there's a model that it's a great question, by the way, but there's a model that looks at where on the pendulum does the power sit? Is it with the seller, or is it with the buyer, or is it with the carrier? And historically, it's always with the buyer. Yeah, so very, very rarely do you see this thing move across towards a carrier. But as I mentioned earlier on, with you can see plenty of evidence with surcharges and so on and so forth. and linked to supply and demand, the power has shifted. Yeah, if you look at the chart now, it's like off the spectrum towards the carrier. And I'm not so sure that's a price gouging thing. I mean, I hear that phrase mentioned a few times. It's not. It's about using price, as I said earlier on, to manage what comes through your system, whether it's shape, size, volume, or whatever else. But at the same time, not every parcel or package equals profit. So it's about, particularly in the e-commerce space, it's about making sure so that you have a sustainable model. So I guess I'm on the carrier side a little bit, but definitely on the pendulum is for the carrier. Sorry, Jamie, dive in, because that's definitely an aeronation.
It's a contentious issue that there's no easy answer to this. The one thing we've all got to be aware of is we're in an open marketplace, and if there are commodities that need to be moved and moved at a premium, if you're not willing to pay that premium, you haven't got the power. And so as we're in an area where healthcare, moving the commodities that are literally saving lives are priority to us, we all have to have an understanding that is where the airlines and the freight carriers are going to be focusing their efforts. And that is just the world we live in these days. Now, there are idiosyncrasies and ups and downs of this, and this won't perhaps be the norm beyond COVID, but really, there are there's a capacity is waning at the moment, and the infrastructure is under stress. And I'm sure over time that we'll come through this, and as we come out the other side, we'll all get to assert some of that power back. But for the moment, I think that is the nature of the world.
I agree.
That does tie in with one of our other questions as well, a little bit looking towards next spring. So we've had Catherine who's asked, how do you see the release or the potential release of a vaccine and the medical consumables impacting capacity in the spring, provided there is an approved vaccine, of course?
Well, let's think about the scale of this. Let's think about if there is a vaccine that is released, it's going to make an iPhone launch pale into insignificance. I mean, the global scope that would be required is massive. Now, it's not within my domain. I'm automotive and mobility, so clearly there are people who know more than I do about this. But really, this is going to have a big impact, and it's going to need global collaboration across multiple air freight, ocean freight, and temperature-controlled transcon solutions across the world to really put this out and make some global impact. So we all, regardless of where you are within TNL and regardless of your view, this is going to impact us all. This is going to impact capacity. It's going to impact our ability to move our own freight. And this is, whether it be, Q4, Q1, Q2, I'm sure this is going to be a prolonged effort that will go on far beyond perhaps just a month or so. So I think there's some more volatile events ahead that we should all be preparing for.
The question is, how do you prepare?
and the truth is, I mean, it is so for me within the automotive mobility segment is I'm talking to my customers on a regular basis, and I present on a weekly the ugly, talk about this is where we are for over the next week, this is where we are for air freight, this is where we are for ocean freight, this is what you need to be aware of moving forward to move your freight. When we talk about just in time to just in case, this is how you prepare and put inventory into your stock levels to know that when this moves out, you probably will not be able to get access to capacity. So what do you do to plan for that now? So a lot of automotive manufacturers are building the vehicles that they can sell, and they're building set mix types of the same standard of vehicle that they are moving relatively quickly. And the more diverse areas that need more components from around the world, they're being moved out to the right, and we're focusing on this more simple manufacturing commodity. Now that's what I would imagine a lot of the world will be doing, is standardizing their commodities, reducing the complexity of their supply chain, and stocking components in support of that. So if they can't get capacity, they can continue this commodity until we move out the other side of that volatile environment. Now that's a small subsegment. I'm sure there are different areas of that.
Yeah, no, and I agree with some of those comments. I mean, we perhaps ought to answer the question before we close the webinar, because it was the point of the webinar, which is, my advice to anybody who's on the line thinking about sort of peak and what's coming up and how to prepare for that, and even going into next year, and it links into the same question about whether there's limited capacity because of vaccines or whatever else, is start early. Number one is start early. So we're seeing plenty, it's the same point, seeing plenty of evidence of sellers advancing their sales and moving away from weeks 48 to 53, where there's going to be so little capacity available globally or domestically. So they're advancing their sales, advancing their sort of marketing material now, and trying to get ahead of the curve. I would thoroughly recommend that to anybody who's listening. Number two, have a diversified supply chain strategy. So if you were with one carrier, think about 2, 3, 4, 5, because A, there may not be the capacity. B, as I mentioned a few times, these surcharges, I think, are going to play a big part in terms of people's costs. So you've got to think about, have you got the right suppliers in the mix in the first place? And the last one, the third one is, I think you've got to be very transparent with your customers. So I mentioned it earlier on around your question around customer expectations. So if you still have on your website, your shirt or t-shirt or microphone will be delivered tomorrow, take it down, because it won't be. And I think you've got to be more realistic with your managing your expectations of your customers by giving ranges. So we see a lot of platforms now giving ranges of delivery so that you're managing the expectation of your supplier. So in the very short term, the capacity challenge isn't going to change, I don't think, anywhere in the world. You can't knock up a building in 4 weeks. It just doesn't happen. So I think it's about trying to do those three things. Start earlier, think about whether you have a diversified supply chain strategy, and thirdly, be very clear around communicating expectations to your customers.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'd add to that is, obviously, as we said earlier with digitalization, the visibility is the key. And obviously, a lot of the challenges that we're going to see across the peak period are going to be the same that we've seen during the height of COVID, essentially. So, yes, there's going to be more strain because you'll have, Christmas presents and all sorts of other things happening on top of that. But it'll certainly still be the same problems. If we go into lockdown again, commercial airline flights are going to be impacted in the same way, and obviously freight gets transported on those as well. So you can use the information that you've had already to plan against those contingencies, and obviously then diversify and try and protect yourself slightly against it. But certainly, analysis, make the time to see what lessons you've learned from this crisis point, and obviously try and get off the hamster wheel for a little bit to take stock, rather than trying to run at 100 miles an hour for the rest of the year. Obviously, if you can take those lessons learned, then I think you'll be in a good place from a strategy perspective, and then you can start to look at decisions you want to make for the business for the better.
Perfect. I think we've got about 3 minutes left, so I think we've got time for one more question before we wrap up. So this is quite a specific question from Rob Palmer. So is freight optimization modeling that looks at transportation costs, truck driver shortages in the US, and changes like Amazon and online pre-owned cars now more important than ever? I don't know who best to answer that. Charles, you've unmuted.
Yes. I'll keep it short. We've only got 2 minutes left. I think, I think Alan mentioned it earlier on, using data in whatever form, by the way. So whether it's demand planning, forecast planning, freight optimization, carrier management, using data to make good decisions as opposed to using historical experience is the right way to go. And certainly from a Canada Post perspective, we have that as a big ticket item for us to be better with our use of data, and that predictive and analytics can be incredibly helpful and keep us very dynamic and agile. So yeah, in short, I would say yes.
Yeah, and just to echo that in the same way, so we see, to Alan's point earlier, visibility within the supply chain creates metrics. Metrics go into a data warehousing, and effectively, we're building things like digital twins to be able to effectively model and create supply chain loops to automatically vary the inputs to an MRP cycle to deal with those fluctuations. Effectively, we understand the trends of how often blank sailings will be, what the lead time fluctuations will be within normal distribution. So this is the future of how supply chain is looking. And that's why we are always pushing for tactical steps in a strategic direction. We see that strategy as the long-term model that a lot of customers will be adhering to. And we're driving information into that model on a daily basis. So yes is a very clear answer from us.
I think just super quickly, I think whenever you're trying to make decisions, based on any data set, whether that's the one that was mentioned or any other ones that's come out of this, is you're trying to influence change. And I think it's important to step outside your business silos when you're influencing that change and look at, what that technology change, what culturally you're trying to achieve, and what downstream and upstream effects that will potentially have within your organization, you know, to bring more value in because of it. So I think that's a key lesson that certainly some of our customers have taken away, is actually some of these decisions are greater than just, you know, the department they're in, and we really need to start looking across the business in terms of making that business continuity planning and future, you know, strategy planning much more diverse in terms of who's involved and who the stakeholders are in sponsoring those things.
Perfect. I think we've come up to the hour mark. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening in. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. And also thank you to our amazing panelists, Charles, Alan and Jamie, for joining and sharing their insights. We will be sharing the recording by email, so you can listen in or send it to a colleague that you think might be interested in some of the topics that we raised. If you have any sort of other questions as well that you feel you'd like to be answered, feel free to email me, and I can see if I can sort of forward that on to these guys as well. But yeah, other than that, thank you so much everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.